My Harvard lawyer boyfriend deliberately lost my dad's case because he thinks having a fill is hard. So I ended his career in a snap. My boyfriend Colin was supposed to be the best thing that happened to my family. Harvard law degree, worked at a prestigious firm, specializing in employment law. When my dad got wrongfully terminated from his job of 23 years, Colin immediately volunteered to take the case. "Don't worry about fees," he said. "We're practically family." My dad had been fired 2 weeks before his pension vested. His boss literally told him, "We found someone younger and cheaper." Clear age discrimination. Colin said it was a slam dunk case. "We'll get him full back pay, his pension, damages, everything." He seemed so confident that my whole family relaxed. Colin filed all the paperwork, scheduled depositions, and gathered evidence. He'd come over for dinner and update my dad on the progress. "Looking really strong," he'd say. "They're going to settle for sure." My dad trusted him completely. Why wouldn't he? Colin was dating his daughter and was a hotshot lawyer who usually charged $500 an hour. 6 months into the case, things started getting weird. Colin kept missing deadlines. Not by much, just a day or two, but enough that the judge noted it. He'd forget to submit crucial documents. He'd show up to meetings unprepared. "Just been swamped at work," he'd explain. But I knew his schedule. He wasn't that busy. Then came the deposition disaster. Colin didn't prep my dad at all. Just showed up and said, "Just tell the truth. You'll be fine." My dad fumbled every question, said things that sounded bad out of context. Colin didn't object once, didn't redirect, just sat there taking notes. The opposing lawyer was this young guy fresh out of school, and even he looked confused by Colin's lack of response. My dad came home devastated. "I think I messed up," he said. Colin assured him it was fine. Depositions always feel worse than they are. The settlement conference was even worse. The company offered $10,000, an insulting amount. Colin told my dad to consider it. "Bird in the hand," he said. "Trials are risky." My dad wanted to fight, but Colin kept discouraging him. "Juries are unpredictable. The judge seems to favor them. Maybe we should take what we can get." My mom pulled me aside that night. "Something's wrong. Colin's not fighting for us." I confronted Colin, but he got defensive. "I'm doing my best. Your dad's case isn't as strong as we thought." But I'd seen the evidence. The emails where they discussed replacing him with someone younger. The performance reviews were stellar until he hit 60. The case was perfect. The trial was set for October. Colin was barely prepared. His opening statement was 2 minutes long. He forgot to enter half the evidence into the record. He let the opposing counsel walk all over my dad during testimony. The jury looked confused. The judge looked annoyed. We lost. Complete defense verdict. My dad got nothing. Lost his pension, his back pay, everything. Colin's response was bizarre. "These things happen. At least it's over now." He seemed almost relieved. Later that night, we were at Colin's apartment, and he'd been drinking. He started talking about the case. "Honestly, this is probably for the best. Your dad would have been around all the time if he'd won. Wanting to golf, asking for advice, and showing up for dinner. Now he'll have to focus on finding work. Won't have time to bother us." I felt my stomach drop. "What are you saying?" Colin laughed. "Come on. You know how annoying father-in-laws are. Always in your business. At least now he'll be too broke and depressed to hassle us much." I stood there frozen. "Did you throw the case?" Colin got this smug look. Throw is a strong word. I just didn't give it my full effort. Strategic incompetence. No way to prove it either. Everything I did was technically within standard practice. Just the bare minimum. I walked out and went straight to Colin's law firm. Not to report him yet, but to his paralegal friend Stacy, who'd always been chatty with me. "Stacy, I need to know something. How many employment discrimination cases has Colin won?" She pulled up his record. He's incredible. 43 wins, 2 losses. Best record in the firm. One of those 2 losses was my dad. I asked to see the other loss. Stacy shouldn't have shown me, but she did. The other loss? His ex-girlfriend's mother's divorce case from 3 years ago. The pattern was right there. Colin had told his entire poker group about it 2 weeks later when he was drunk again, bragging about how he'd figured out the perfect way to keep in-laws at a distance. Offer to help with legal stuff, then accidentally lose. They're too ashamed to come around much after that. His friend Miles was horrified. Miles also happened to be engaged to my cousin. He called me immediately. You need to know what Colin just said. He'd recorded the whole conversation on his phone for his podcast about poker nights. Never published that episode, but he had the audio. Colin's entire confession. Laughing about how my dad cried after the verdict. Joking about how he'd never have to spend holidays with my family now. Explaining his system for looking incompetent while avoiding malpractice claims. I sent the recording to Colin's firm, the State Bar Association, and my dad's former company. Colin tried to call me hundreds of times. I blocked his number after the 100th call and sat on my apartment floor with my phone. I played Miles's recording again, turning the volume up until Colin's laugh filled the room. The part where he described my dad crying after the verdict made my hands shake, but not from sadness anymore. The rage that replaced my shock felt different, cold and sharp, like I could finally see everything clearly for the first time in months. I called Miles back and left a message asking for the full recording plus anything else from that poker night. He called back within 20 minutes and said he'd send everything right away. My email pinged an hour later with a 20-minute audio file and 6 photos of text messages, where Colin bragged to the poker group about his system for keeping future in-laws away. One text said he'd perfected the method after his ex-girlfriend's mom kept calling him for legal advice. Another described my dad as the perfect test case because the evidence was so strong nobody would suspect intentional failure. I opened a new document on my laptop and started organizing everything into a timeline. I pulled out the case record information Stacy had shown me, matching Colin's 43 wins against his 2 losses. I added notes about every missed deadline, every forgotten document, every moment during the trial when Colin had just sat there while the other lawyer destroyed my dad's testimony. The poker night recording went into a separate folder with timestamps marking each confession. Colin's texts got their own section with dates showing he'd been planning this strategy for years. My dad's case documents filled another folder, and I went through every email and performance review that proved how strong his case should have been. By the time the sun came up, I had a complete evidence package that told the whole story of Colin's deliberate sabotage. I showered and changed clothes, then headed straight to Colin's law firm. The receptionist smiled when I walked in at 8 in the morning and asked how she could help. I told her I needed an emergency meeting with the managing partner because I had evidence of attorney misconduct involving one of their lawyers. Her smile disappeared and she picked up the phone. She tried to schedule me for next week, but I said this couldn't wait and involved serious ethical violations. She put me on hold, then came back and said someone would see me shortly. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room with a woman who introduced herself as Catalina Rivas, the senior partner who ran Colin's department. I handed her a folder with copies of everything and asked her to listen to the recording first. She put in her earbuds, and I watched her face get harder with each minute that passed. When Colin's voice described his system for strategic incompetence and laughed about my dad being too broke and depressed to bother us, she stopped the recording and pulled out the earbuds. She asked if I had copies of everything I'd brought, and I said yes. She spent the next hour asking detailed questions about the timeline, about my dad's case, about when I first suspected something was wrong. She asked if I was willing to provide a formal statement, and I said I'd do it right there. She called in another attorney who took notes while I explained everything from the moment Colin volunteered to take the case through the trial and his drunken confession. Catalina explained that attorney misconduct was taken extremely seriously, and this recording alone gave them grounds for immediate investigation. She said they'd be reviewing every case Colin had ever handled, especially the other loss involving his ex-girlfriend's mother. She promised Colin would be suspended pending their internal review, and that they'd be contacting the State Bar Association. I walked out of the law firm 2 hours later with Catalina's card and her personal cell number in case I remembered anything else. My next stop was the State Bar Association offices across town. I filled out a formal ethics complaint form and attached copies of all my evidence. The intake attorney was a young guy who looked bored until he started reading through my materials. His expression changed as he listened to parts of the recording, and he told me this was one of the most clear cases of misconduct he'd seen. He said someone would be in touch soon to schedule a detailed interview. I drove home and collapsed on my couch, finally feeling the exhaustion from staying up all night. My phone rang that same afternoon with a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gavin Rivas, the ethics attorney assigned to my complaint. He said he'd reviewed my evidence and needed to schedule a detailed interview as soon as possible. He explained that intentionally sabotaging a client's case was among the most serious violations an attorney could commit and could result in disbarment. We scheduled a meeting for 2 days later at his office. When I arrived, Gavin had my entire evidence package spread across a conference table. We spent 3 hours walking through every detail of Colin's sabotage, from the missed deadlines to the unprepared depositions to the trial where he forgot to enter half the evidence. Gavin was particularly interested in the pattern between my dad's case and the ex-girlfriend's mother's divorce. He asked if I thought there might be other victims we hadn't identified yet, and I said I didn't know, but it seemed possible given how proud Colin had been about his system. Gavin took detailed notes and recorded our conversation with my permission. He asked about my relationship with Colin, about how my family had trusted him, about the moment I realized he'd thrown the case on purpose. By the end of the interview, my throat was raw from talking, and my hands hurt from gripping the arms of my chair so tight. Gavin walked me to the door of his office and shook my hand. He told me the Bar Association would be starting a full investigation that could take several months to complete. His face looked serious as he explained they'd be interviewing witnesses, reviewing all of Colin's cases, and building a complete picture of his misconduct pattern. But he said the evidence I'd provided was so clear and strong that they had good grounds to seek an emergency suspension of Colin's license right away. He asked if I was ready for this to become public and possibly get media attention. I told him I didn't care who knew about it as long as Colin faced consequences. Gavin nodded and said he'd be in touch soon about next steps. I drove straight to my parents' house because they'd been calling me constantly since I walked out on Colin at his apartment. My phone showed 23 missed calls from my mom and 15 from my dad. When I pulled into their driveway, both of them came outside before I even got out of my car. My dad looked terrible. He'd always been the kind of guy who stood up straight and smiled a lot, but now his shoulders were bent forward and his face looked gray. He seemed like he'd aged 10 years just since the trial ended. My mom's eyes were red and puffy from crying. She grabbed me and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. My dad joined in, and we all stood there in the driveway holding each other. My mom kept saying she'd been so worried about me. I told them we should go inside because I had a lot to explain. We sat down at their kitchen table where we'd had so many dinners with Colin. The thought of him sitting in that chair acting like he cared about my dad made me feel sick. I started from the beginning and told them everything. I explained how Colin had confessed to throwing the case on purpose. I described finding his case record through Stacy and seeing the pattern with his ex-girlfriend's mother's divorce. I told them about Miles recording the poker night conversation where Colin bragged about his system. My mom started crying again when I explained that I'd reported everything to Colin's law firm and the State Bar Association. My dad just sat there staring at his hands on the table. He asked if I was sure Colin had done it on purpose. I pulled out my phone and told them I had proof. I played them the recording that Miles had sent me. Colin's voice came through the speaker, laughing and joking with his poker friends. I watched my dad's face as he heard Colin describe how he'd figured out the perfect way to keep future in-laws away. When Colin's voice said the part about my dad being too broke and depressed to bother us much, my dad's whole face just fell apart. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Tears started running down his cheeks. The recording kept playing, and Colin laughed about how my dad had cried after the verdict. My dad made this awful choking sound and covered his face with his hands. My mom couldn't take it anymore and got up from the table. She went into the bathroom, and I could hear her sobbing through the door. I stopped the recording even though there was more. My dad sat there with his hands over his face for a long time. When my mom came back, her eyes were even more red, but she looked angry now instead of just sad. She sat down next to my dad and put her arm around him. She told me she'd known something was wrong during the whole case. She said Colin hadn't been fighting for us the way a good lawyer should, but she'd never imagined it was this bad. She'd never thought someone could be this deliberately cruel. My dad finally looked up at me and asked what happens next. I explained that Colin's law firm was doing their own investigation and would probably fire him. I told him about Gavin at the Bar Association and how they were working on getting Colin's law license suspended. My dad was quiet for a really long time. He just stared at the table and didn't say anything. Then he told me he'd trusted Colin completely. He said he felt like such a fool for believing Colin was trying his best. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand. I told him this wasn't his fault. Colin had betrayed his trust on purpose, and that reflected badly on Colin, not on Dad's judgment. My dad squeezed my hand, but he still looked broken. The next afternoon, I got a call from a lawyer named Pamela Norton. She said my mom had found her number through a friend who worked in the legal community. Pamela explained she'd heard about my dad's case through gossip among lawyers. Word was spreading fast about Colin's confession and what he'd done. Pamela specialized in employment law just like Colin did. She offered to review my dad's whole situation for free to see if there was any way to go after the company again now that we had proof Colin had sabotaged everything. I told her I'd bring all the files over to her office. I spent that evening gathering every document from my dad's case. All the emails showing age discrimination. The performance reviews that were perfect until he turned 60. The trial transcripts showing how badly Colin had performed. I added copies of Miles's recording and all the evidence I'd collected about Colin's pattern. The next morning, I met Pamela at her office downtown. She had gray hair and sharp eyes that reminded me of my high school principal. She spent 2 hours going through every single page while I sat across from her desk. She kept shaking her head and making notes. Finally, she looked up at me and explained that we couldn't retry the case because of something called res judicata, but she said we might be able to file a legal malpractice claim against Colin himself. She also thought we could try to reopen settlement talks with my dad's former company now that we had evidence their win was based on fraud. I asked her how long that would take, and she said it depended on a lot of factors. Pamela told me she'd reach out to Mitchell Schwartz, the lawyer who'd represented the company against my dad. She said she wanted to see how he'd react to learning the truth about what Colin had done. 2 days later, Pamela called me back. She said Mitchell had agreed to meet with her after she'd mentioned having proof that my dad's lawyer had deliberately thrown the case. She sounded excited about the meeting. That same afternoon, I got a text from Stacy. It just said Colin was suspended and had to clean out his office this morning. She said security had walked him out and he'd looked completely destroyed. She sent me a photo she'd taken from across the parking lot showing Colin carrying a box to his car. Even from far away, I could see how defeated he looked. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction looking at that picture. 3 days after I'd submitted all my evidence, Colin's career was falling apart. But it wasn't enough yet. That night, my mom called me in a panic. She said Colin had somehow found their address and shown up at the house. He'd been ringing the doorbell and banging on the door begging to talk to my dad. My mom had called the police right away. Colin left before the cops arrived, but then he just sat in his car outside their house. My mom said he was still out there just sitting and staring at their front door. My dad got on the phone and told Colin through the window that if he didn't leave right now, he'd file for a restraining order. Colin finally drove away after 2 hours. My mom sounded scared and angry. She asked if I thought Colin would come back. I told her to call the police immediately if he showed up again and to document everything. The next morning, Gavin called me with an update. He said the Bar Association was moving faster than usual because the evidence was so clear. They were filing for emergency suspension of Colin's law license based on deliberate client sabotage. The hearing was scheduled for next week. Gavin asked if I was willing to testify at the hearing. I told him yes immediately. I wanted to look Colin in the face and tell everyone exactly what he'd done to my family. Gavin said he'd send me the details about when and where to show up. He warned me that Colin's lawyer would probably try to attack my credibility, but the recording made their job almost impossible. I thanked him and hung up feeling like things were finally moving in the right direction. The next day, I called Pamela and asked if she knew any good private investigators. She gave me Austin Perez's number and said he was thorough and discreet. I met Austin at a coffee shop that afternoon and showed him everything I had on Colin. Austin was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a calm way of listening that made me feel like he actually understood what I needed. He took notes while I explained Colin's pattern with the 2 cases and said his first step would be tracking down Colin's ex-girlfriend to see if she'd talk. I gave him her name from what Stacy had told me, and Austin said he'd start right away. 3 days later, Austin called and said he'd found her living in another state. She'd agreed to talk to him after he explained why he was calling. Austin met with her in person and recorded the whole conversation with her permission. When he came back to meet with me, he played the recording and I listened to her voice describing exactly what I'd suspected. She said Colin had taken her mother's divorce case 3 years ago and seemed enthusiastic at first. But then he started missing court dates and forgetting to file important paperwork. He kept telling her mother to accept whatever settlement the husband offered, even though it was way less than she deserved. The ex-girlfriend said she'd thought something was wrong, but Colin kept insisting he was doing his best, and the case was harder than expected. When they lost, Colin had seemed relieved instead of upset. She'd broken up with him a few months later for unrelated reasons, but always wondered if he'd thrown the case on purpose. Hearing about my dad's case made everything click into place for her. She told Austin she'd been carrying guilt for years, thinking maybe she should have reported her suspicions, but she had no proof and thought people would think she was just a bitter ex. Now she wanted to come forward and help if it would stop Colin from doing this to anyone else. Austin helped her write a detailed statement describing everything that happened with her mother's case. She listed specific examples of Colin's incompetence and how he'd discouraged her mother from fighting. She mentioned how Colin had seemed almost happy when the case ended badly, and how he'd made comments about her mother being demanding and difficult. The statement was 5 pages long, and Austin documented everything carefully. He sent copies to both the Bar Association and Colin's law firm, along with the recording of his interview with her. Gavin called me the same day he received it and said this was huge, because it established a clear pattern across multiple cases. The ex-girlfriend's willingness to come forward meant they now had 2 separate victims describing nearly identical behavior from Colin. Austin compiled everything into a professional report with timelines and evidence comparisons. He showed how Colin's win rate dropped to 0 only in cases involving potential family connections. The pattern was impossible to ignore or explain away as coincidence. While Austin was finishing his investigation, Pamela scheduled her meeting with Mitchell. She'd told him she had new evidence about my dad's case and he'd agreed to meet at his office downtown. Pamela called me right after the meeting and said Mitchell's reaction had been exactly what we needed. She'd played him excerpts from the poker night recording where Colin admitted throwing the case and explained his system for keeping in-laws away. Mitchell's face had gone completely white, according to Pamela. He'd stopped the recording and asked to hear it again. Then he'd sat there quiet for a full minute before saying he needed to consult with his client immediately about the ethical problems this created. Pamela said Mitchell seemed genuinely shocked and disturbed. He told her he'd had no idea Colin was sabotaging his own client, and if he'd known, he would have reported it himself. Mitchell explained that winning a case because the other attorney deliberately lost undermined the whole legal system. He said his client would want to know about this right away because being associated with a fraudulent proceeding could damage their reputation. 2 days later, Pamela got a call from Bernadette Knight in the HR department at my dad's former company. Bernadette said the company's legal team was very concerned about what they'd learned from Mitchell. They wanted to meet with Pamela to discuss resolution options before this situation became a public scandal. Bernadette emphasized that the company had no knowledge of Colin's sabotage, and they were troubled by their unintentional role in what was essentially a fraudulent legal proceeding. Pamela told me this was a good sign because it meant the company was worried about their reputation and might be willing to settle generously to make this go away quietly. She scheduled a meeting with Bernadette for the following week to discuss what kind of resolution they had in mind. The emergency bar hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9. I drove to the hearing with my parents and we sat in the waiting area outside the hearing room. My dad looked nervous and kept adjusting his tie. My mom held his hand and told him everything would be okay. Gavin arrived with his briefcase full of evidence and gave us a quick update. He said Colin's attorney would try to minimize the poker night recording, but the pattern Austin had documented made their job nearly impossible. When they called us into the hearing room, I saw Colin sitting at a table with his attorney. Colin looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled and he had dark circles under his eyes. He glanced at me when we walked in, but I looked away. The hearing officer was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Gavin presented his evidence methodically, starting with the poker night recording. Colin's attorney objected and tried to argue the recording was taken out of context and Colin had been drunk. But then Gavin played the full 20 minutes, and there was no way to misinterpret what Colin was saying. He was clearly sober enough to explain his entire system in detail. He laughed about my dad crying after the verdict. He bragged about how clever he was to find a way to sabotage cases without getting caught. The hearing officer's expression got harder and harder as the recording played. When it finished, she asked Colin's attorney if he had any explanation for what they'd just heard. Colin's attorney asked for permission to have Colin testify, and the hearing officer agreed. Colin took the stand and immediately started claiming he'd been drunk and exaggerating to impress his poker friends. He said he never actually threw any cases, and his performance in my dad's case was just the result of being overworked and stressed. But then Gavin started walking through every specific instance of incompetence during the trial. Why did Colin forget to enter crucial evidence into the record? Colin stammered and said it was an oversight. Why didn't he prep my dad for the deposition? Colin claimed he thought my dad would do better speaking naturally. Why did he miss multiple deadlines? Colin said he was juggling too many cases. Gavin pulled out Colin's calendar, showing he'd had plenty of time to prepare properly. He showed emails where Colin had actively discouraged my dad from fighting for a better settlement. He presented the ex-girlfriend's statement describing identical behavior in her mother's case. Colin couldn't explain any of it convincingly. His answers got weaker and more defensive. The hearing officer asked him directly if he had deliberately sabotaged my dad's case, and Colin said no, but his voice shook when he answered. The hearing officer took a short recess to review the evidence. When she came back, she said she was granting the emergency suspension effective immediately. Colin could not practice law while the full investigation continued. Colin's attorney stood up and argued that this would destroy Colin's career and reputation. The hearing officer looked directly at Colin and said he destroyed his own career when he decided to sabotage a client's case for personal convenience. She said the evidence presented today showed a disturbing pattern of deliberately harming clients who trusted him. The poker night recording alone was damning, but combined with the ex-girlfriend's testimony and the documented incompetence in my dad's case, there was no question that emergency action was necessary to protect the public. She set a date for the full disbarment hearing in 6 weeks, and told Colin he needed to notify all his current clients immediately that he could no longer represent them. Colin's face crumbled. His attorney tried to say something else, but the hearing officer cut him off and said the decision was final. I watched Colin stand up and gather his papers with shaking hands. He looked across the room at me and tried to catch my eye, but I stared right through him like he wasn't even there. The same way he'd looked through my dad's pain and suffering like it meant nothing. My dad squeezed my hand and my mom put her arm around my shoulders. We walked out of the hearing room together while Colin stood frozen at his table. In the hallway, Gavin told us this was a major victory, and the emergency suspension almost never got granted unless the evidence was overwhelming. He said the full investigation would continue, but today's hearing made it clear which direction things were heading. My dad actually smiled for the first time in months. Within 3 days, the story broke in the legal community news. The headlines talked about a Harvard-trained lawyer suspended for allegedly sabotaging cases involving potential in-laws. The articles mentioned the poker night recording and the pattern across multiple cases. Colin's law firm released an official statement saying they were conducting a thorough internal investigation and took attorney misconduct extremely seriously. They emphasized that they had suspended Colin immediately upon learning of the allegations and were cooperating fully with the Bar Association. The statement said they were reviewing all of Colin's cases to identify any other potential victims. My phone started getting messages from people I barely knew, asking if the Colin Williamson in the news was my ex-boyfriend. I didn't respond to most of them, but I did text Miles to thank him again for recording that poker night and having the courage to send it to me. He texted back saying he was glad he'd done the right thing and he hoped my dad was okay now. Stacy sent me a message saying the whole firm was in shock, and nobody could believe Colin had done something so deliberately cruel. She said several partners were furious because this kind of scandal damaged the firm's reputation and trustworthiness. Within a week of the scandal breaking, Pamela called to say she'd set up a meeting with Mitchell and Bernadette from my dad's former company to discuss settlement options. She explained the company was very worried about being connected to a case where they only won because the other lawyer threw it on purpose. The meeting happened at Pamela's office on a Tuesday morning, and she told me afterward that Mitchell looked really uncomfortable the whole time. Bernadette kept checking her phone like she was getting messages from her boss every few minutes. Pamela said she started by playing parts of the poker night recording where Colin admitted to sabotaging the case. Mitchell's face went red when he heard Colin laughing about my dad crying after the verdict. Bernadette actually put her head in her hands. Mitchell told Pamela he was really surprised by how badly Colin did at trial because the case evidence was so strong. He said he kept waiting for Colin to object or redirect or enter the important documents, but Colin just sat there doing nothing. Mitchell admitted he thought maybe Colin was having some kind of personal crisis during the trial. He said if he'd known Colin was sabotaging his own client on purpose, he would have reported it himself because it makes the whole legal system look bad. Bernadette explained the company's main worry was the public finding out they won a discrimination case only because the victim's lawyer deliberately lost. She said their legal team reviewed everything and agreed my dad's original case was really strong and should have won. The company wanted to settle fast and quietly to avoid any more bad publicity. Pamela presented my dad's demands, which included his full pension, 3 years of back pay, and money for emotional pain. Mitchell and Bernadette stepped out to call their boss, And when they came back 20 minutes later, they agreed to everything. Pamela called me right after the meeting ended and said the company offered a package that included restoring my dad's full pension benefits like he'd never been fired, 3 years of back pay calculated at his final salary, and extra money for emotional pain and suffering. She reviewed all the numbers with me and explained this was way better than what my dad probably would have won if the trial had gone right. The settlement was actually more generous because the company was so desperate to make this go away before reporters started asking questions. I drove straight to my parents' house to tell them. My dad was in the garage trying to fix an old lawnmower because he couldn't afford to buy a new one or pay someone to repair it. I asked him to come inside because Pamela had news about the case. My mom was making lunch and she turned off the stove when she saw my face. I told them about the settlement offer and went through all the details Pamela had explained. My dad just stared at me for a long minute like he didn't understand the words. Then he started crying. Not quiet tears, but full sobbing that shook his whole body. My mom started crying too and wrapped her arms around him. Dad kept saying he couldn't believe this was real after spending months thinking he'd lost everything. He said he'd been sure he'd have to sell the house and work until he died because of what Colin did. I sat with him at the kitchen table while he tried to pull himself together. He told me he'd been having nightmares every night about losing the house. He said he dreamed about telling my mom they had to move into a tiny apartment and he couldn't retire like they'd planned. The settlement meant he could actually retire with enough money to live on and keep the house. He said that's all he ever wanted, just to retire with some dignity after working for 23 years. My mom made coffee and we sat there for over an hour while Dad processed everything. He kept asking if I was sure the company really agreed to all of it. I showed him the email Pamela sent with the settlement terms written out. He read it 3 times. A few days later, Catalina called my cell phone directly. She said Colin's law firm had finished their investigation and they were firing him for cause. She explained that meant Colin wouldn't get any severance pay or benefits. The firm found clear evidence of deliberate client sabotage and violations of professional rules. Catalina said she wanted me to know they were also going back through every single case Colin ever handled to find other possible victims. She sounded really angry when she talked about how Colin had damaged the firm's reputation. She said they built their business on trust, and Colin destroyed that. The firm was taking this so seriously, they hired outside investigators to review Colin's entire career. Within 2 weeks, the investigators found 2 more cases where Colin did suspiciously bad work. Both cases involved clients who had family connections to women Colin was dating at the time. One case was from 4 years ago when Colin represented a woman's uncle in a contract dispute. Colin barely prepared, and the uncle lost everything. The other case was from 2 years ago involving a girlfriend's stepfather's business lawsuit. Same pattern of missing deadlines, forgetting documents, and weak performance. Catalina told me the firm was reaching out to both former clients to offer help and reporting everything to the Bar Association. She said they wanted to make this right, even though it happened years ago. My dad officially accepted the settlement offer after Pamela reviewed every detail with him one more time. The company processed everything really fast because they wanted this finished before anyone else found out. Within 2 weeks, my dad got a check for the full amount of back pay and emotional damages. His pension benefits got restored in the company system like he'd never been fired at all. He could start collecting his pension immediately since he was already past the age. I went with Dad to the bank when he deposited the check. He just kept staring at the deposit slip like he expected it to disappear. The bank manager congratulated him, and Dad actually smiled for the first time in months. That night, my parents took me out to dinner at a nice restaurant they never would have gone to before because of money worries. Dad ordered an expensive steak and told the waiter to bring a good bottle of wine. I started seeing a therapist named Macy to help me deal with everything that happened. My regular doctor suggested it after I told her I was having trouble sleeping, and kept replaying Colin's confession in my head. Macy's office was in a quiet building near downtown. She had comfortable chairs and kept tissues on every table. During our first session, Macy asked me to tell her the whole story from the beginning. I talked for almost the full hour about meeting Colin, my dad's case, discovering the sabotage, and everything that happened after. Macy listened without interrupting and took notes. At the end, she said what Colin did was a serious betrayal, and it made sense that I was struggling to process it. She explained that Colin was really skilled at manipulation and hiding his true intentions. Macy said trusting someone you love doesn't make you weak or stupid. She helped me understand that Colin deliberately acted trustworthy to hide what he was really doing. Over the next few sessions, Macy worked with me on separating my anger at Colin from my feelings about relationships in general. I kept saying I should have seen the signs, and I was stupid for missing them. Macy pointed out that Colin's whole system depended on looking normal while doing terrible things. She said the problem was Colin's character, not something wrong with trust or love itself. Macy gave me exercises to practice recognizing the difference between healthy relationships and manipulation. We talked about red flags I could watch for in the future. She helped me see that Colin's betrayal taught me important lessons about trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. A few weeks later, Austin called to say his investigation was complete. I met him at a coffee shop downtown where he spread out his report across the table. The numbers were damning. Colin won cases at a 96% rate overall, but when the client had any family connection to someone he was dating, his win rate dropped to 0. Austin had documented 4 cases total where this pattern appeared. My dad's case, the ex-girlfriend's mother's divorce, and 2 other cases Austin tracked down through court records and interviews. In each situation, Colin's performance showed the same suspicious incompetence: missed deadlines, unprepared court appearances, failure to enter crucial evidence. Austin had even found emails where Colin discussed one case with a colleague, showing he clearly understood the winning strategy, but then failed to execute it at trial. The report was 50 pages of detailed analysis with exhibits, timelines, and statistical comparisons. Austin told me this was the clearest pattern of deliberate misconduct he'd ever documented in 20 years as an investigator. I sent the complete report to Gavin at the Bar Association that same day. Gavin called me 2 days later, sounding energized. The bar's full investigation had reached the same conclusions as Austin's independent analysis. Colin deliberately sabotaged multiple clients' cases for personal reasons. The evidence was overwhelming. Gavin walked me through their findings, explaining they'd interviewed witnesses, reviewed court transcripts, and analyzed Colin's entire case history. Every piece of evidence pointed to intentional misconduct rather than mere incompetence. The Bar Association was recommending permanent disbarment with no possibility of reinstatement. Gavin explained this was the most serious penalty available, reserved for attorneys who fundamentally betray client trust. He said Colin's pattern showed premeditation and repeated violations, making rehabilitation impossible to assess. The formal disbarment hearing was scheduled for early December. I received an official letter from the Bar Association inviting me to provide an impact statement at Colin's hearing. All of his identified victims received the same invitation. I sat at my kitchen table for hours working on my statement, writing and rewriting until I got it right. I focused on how Colin's betrayal affected my dad and our family, not on my personal relationship with him. I described Dad's 23 years of loyal service and how he trusted Colin completely. I explained how Colin weaponized that trust to destroy Dad's financial security and peace of mind. I wrote about Dad's sleepless nights and Mom's constant worry about losing their house. I detailed the emotional trauma of watching my father cry after the verdict, not knowing his own lawyer had engineered that loss. I kept my tone factual and measured, letting the events speak for themselves. The statement ran 3 pages, single-spaced. The hearing took place in a formal conference room at the Bar Association headquarters. I arrived early with my parents and Pamela. Colin sat at a table with his attorney, an older man who kept shuffling papers and looking uncomfortable. The panel consisted of 3 attorneys and 2 public members, all sitting behind a raised platform. The room felt official and serious, nothing like a regular courtroom. The panel chair called the hearing to order and explained the process. Each victim would read their impact statement. Then the panel would hear from Colin and his attorney before deliberating. I went first. My hands shook slightly as I held my statement, but my voice stayed steady. I read every word I'd written about Dad trusting Colin completely and how that trust got used against him. I explained that Colin didn't just lose a case through incompetence. He deliberately destroyed my dad's financial security and peace of mind for his own convenience. I described how Dad had to choose between buying groceries and paying utilities some weeks. I detailed the depression and anxiety that consumed him after the verdict. When I finished, the panel chair thanked me and I returned to my seat. Dad squeezed my hand. Colin's ex-girlfriend testified next through a video call since she lived out of state. She described her mother's divorce case and how Colin discouraged her mom from fighting for a fair settlement. She explained that her mother deserved significant assets based on 30 years of marriage, but Colin kept pushing her to accept minimal amounts. He showed up to mediation unprepared and failed to present evidence of her husband's hidden income. The ex-girlfriend's voice cracked when she described how her mother ended up in a small apartment while her ex-husband kept the house and retirement accounts. She said she blamed herself for years, thinking she'd chosen a bad lawyer for her mom. Learning about the pattern made her realize Colin did it deliberately. The other victims Austin identified submitted written statements that the panel chair read aloud. Each one described similar patterns of suspicious incompetence in cases involving family connections. The panel deliberated for 48 minutes. I watched the clock on the wall tick forward while we all sat in silence. Colin stared at the table in front of him. His attorney whispered something to him, but Colin didn't respond. When the panel returned, the chair announced their decision immediately. Permanent disbarment with no possibility of reinstatement. The room stayed quiet as the chair explained their reasoning. Colin's conduct represented a fundamental betrayal of the attorney-client relationship. He deliberately sabotaged multiple clients for personal gain. The pattern showed premeditation and repeated violations. Such conduct could not be tolerated in the legal profession. The chair stated that rehabilitation couldn't be assessed when an attorney deliberately harms clients as part of a calculated system. Colin's law license was revoked effective immediately. I watched Colin's face as the disbarment got announced. He looked completely destroyed. All the arrogance and smugness I'd seen at his apartment that night was gone. His attorney stood up and tried to argue for suspension instead of disbarment. He claimed Colin showed remorse and deserved a chance at redemption. The panel chair cut him off. She said the pattern of deliberate sabotage made rehabilitation impossible to assess. Colin had systematically betrayed vulnerable clients who trusted him. The decision was final. Colin's attorney gathered his papers and they left through a side door. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction watching him go. Pamela filed a legal malpractice lawsuit against Colin on Dad's behalf the following week. The lawsuit sought damages for emotional distress and financial harm caused by his sabotage. Pamela explained this was separate from the settlement with the company. That settlement addressed the wrongful termination. This lawsuit focused specifically on Colin's professional negligence and deliberate misconduct. She told us malpractice cases usually take years, but this one might move faster given Colin's disbarment and the overwhelming evidence. Dad signed all the paperwork at Pamela's office. He looked tired but determined. Mom told Pamela this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about making sure Colin faced every possible consequence. Colin's malpractice insurance carrier contacted Pamela within 2 weeks. They'd reviewed all the evidence from the disbarment hearing and Austin's investigation. Their attorney told Pamela they wouldn't contest the claim. Colin's deliberate misconduct was indefensible and violated his policy terms, but they wanted to settle quickly to avoid prolonged litigation. They offered a settlement that covered all of Dad's legal fees from both the original case and the new proceedings. The settlement also included additional money for Dad's suffering and emotional distress. Pamela negotiated the final amount up by another $20,000. Dad accepted the offer. The insurance company processed everything within a month. My parents used part of the settlement money to book a 2-week vacation to a beach resort they'd always wanted to visit. They left in early January when the weather was cold and gray at home. Dad sent me photos every day. Pictures of him on the beach looking relaxed and tan. Photos of fancy dinners and sunset walks. Mom texted that Dad was finally sleeping through the night again without nightmares about the trial. She said he smiled more in 1 week of vacation than he had in the entire previous year. They came back refreshed and happy, talking about planning another trip in the spring. Dad told me the vacation felt like the first time in forever, that he could just enjoy life without constant worry crushing him. I started apartment hunting 2 weeks after they got back. My old place had too many memories of Colin picking me up for dates and staying over on weekends. Every corner reminded me of something he said or did. I found a 1-bedroom across town near a park I'd never been to with him. The building was older but had big windows and hardwood floors. I signed the lease the same day I saw it. Moving day was exhausting but felt good. I hired movers for the heavy stuff and spent 3 days unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. I bought a new couch because the old one was where Colin sat when he told me about his Harvard classes. I picked out curtains and kitchen supplies and artwork for the walls. Everything was mine and had nothing to do with him. The place started feeling like home after about a week. I could walk in without thinking about him every 5 minutes. Stacy called me one afternoon while I was hanging pictures. She said Colin's firm made major changes after everything came out. They now require 2 attorney oversight for any case involving family connections to lawyers at the firm. They also implemented quarterly performance reviews where senior partners check case files for signs of inadequate representation. Stacy told me the managing partners specifically cited my willingness to come forward as the reason they took such aggressive action. She said most people would have stayed quiet to avoid drama, but speaking up probably prevented Colin from sabotaging more cases. The firm wanted me to know they were serious about fixing the problems that let Colin operate unchecked for so long. A letter arrived at my parents' house about 3 weeks after the disbarment. Mom forwarded it to my new address. The return label showed a name I didn't recognize from a city 2 hours away. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman explaining she was one of the other victims Austin found during his investigation. She wrote that Colin had represented her in an employment case 5 years ago when he was dating her daughter. The case should have been simple, but Colin barely fought for her, and she lost. She spent years thinking she just had a weak case or bad luck. Learning the truth about Colin's pattern lifted this huge weight off her shoulders. She thanked me for exposing him, and said she was working with Pamela now to seek compensation through the malpractice claim. The letter made me realize how many people Colin hurt, and how many of them blamed themselves instead of him. Dad officially retired in March with his full pension restored. He spent his first week of retirement buying gardening supplies and golf clubs. He joined a seniors league at the public course and started growing tomatoes and peppers in the backyard. Mom sent me photos of him on the patio every morning with his coffee looking relaxed and tan. He called me one Sunday afternoon while I was grocery shopping. He told me he was happier now than before any of this happened. Working for people who valued him so little had been slowly killing his spirit for years. Now he could spend his days doing things he actually enjoyed instead of stressing about performance reviews and office politics. His voice sounded lighter than I'd heard it in forever. I went on my first date in April with a guy I met through a friend from work. Macy had been helping me recognize what healthy relationships looked like versus the manipulation tactics Colin used. She reminded me during our session before the date that Colin's betrayal taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The date went okay. Nothing special, but the guy was nice and respectful. We went out twice more before mutually deciding we weren't a great match. I dated a few other people over the next couple months. Some worked out better than others. Macy helped me see that I was being more careful about red flags and paying attention to how people treated me. I wasn't rushing into anything or ignoring warning signs like I might have before. Gavin called me in early May. He said the Bar Association was getting requests from legal ethics professors asking to use Colin's case in their classes. The disbarment had become this cautionary tale in the legal community about what happens when attorneys betray client trust. Gavin told me they were developing training materials that used Colin's case to illustrate serious misconduct and its consequences. He said my case was spreading through legal circles as an example of why ethics rules exist and why they're enforced so strictly. Lawyers at conferences were apparently discussing it as a warning about conflicts of interest and the importance of zealous representation. I ran into Miles at a coffee shop near my new apartment in June. He was there meeting someone for his podcast. We talked for about 20 minutes while he waited. He told me the poker group cut Colin off completely after everything came out. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. Miles said he felt glad he recorded that night because staying silent would have made him part of Colin's cruelty. He admitted he almost deleted the recording at first, because it felt like betraying a friend. Then he realized Colin had betrayed everyone who trusted him, and that friendship didn't mean protecting someone from consequences they deserved. Miles asked how my dad was doing and seemed genuinely happy to hear he was retired and thriving. My relationship with my parents got stronger through all of this. We had family dinners every couple weeks where we just enjoyed being together without the stress that dominated the previous year. Mom told me one night while we were cleaning up dishes that she was proud of how I handled everything. She said a lot of people would have fallen apart or let anger consume them, but I channeled it into action and got justice for Dad. We learned we could survive terrible betrayals and come out better on the other side. Dad started asking my opinion on things more and treating me like an equal adult instead of just his kid. The whole dynamic shifted into something more mature and respectful. Colin tried reaching out through a mutual acquaintance in July asking for closure. The acquaintance called to relay the message, and I told them I wasn't interested in talking to Colin. Macy helped me understand during our next session that closure comes from within yourself, not from conversations with people who betrayed you. She explained that Colin wanted closure to make himself feel better, not to help me heal. I didn't owe him anything. My healing process didn't require his participation or approval. Learning to cut off contact and move forward without needing his explanation or apology was actually an important part of recovery. I felt good about declining. My boss called me into her office in August. I thought maybe I'd messed something up, but she told me I was getting promoted to senior analyst with a significant raise. She said my work had improved noticeably over the past year. I seemed more confident and assertive in meetings and better at making decisions under pressure. The whole experience with Colin had somehow translated into better job performance. I learned to trust my judgment and stand up for what I believed was right. Those skills carried over into my professional life. The promotion felt like proof that I'd grown from everything that happened instead of letting it break me down. Dad called me in September with news that he'd been thinking about what to do with part of the settlement money. He wanted to set up a small fund to help other workers who got wrongfully fired but couldn't afford lawyers. He'd been talking to Pamela about how many people lose their jobs unfairly and never fight back because legal fees are too expensive. Pamela's firm agreed to partner with him to screen cases and identify situations where they could actually make a difference. Dad put $50,000 into the fund, and Pamela's firm agreed to handle cases at reduced rates for people the fund selected. They created an application process where workers could submit their termination details and evidence. Dad reviewed applications himself and helped decide which cases had the strongest merit. The first person they helped was a woman in her 50s, who got fired right before her benefits kicked in. Pamela took her case and won a settlement within 3 months. Dad called me after that first win, sounding happier than I'd heard him in years. He said being able to help someone else avoid what he went through gave him a sense of purpose he didn't expect. The fund helped 6 more people over the next few months. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment from the Bar Association. Inside was the final report on Colin's case documenting every instance of sabotage they'd uncovered. The report was 40 pages long and detailed not just my dad's case, but the complete pattern across all 3 cases Colin had thrown. They documented his win rate dropping to 0 when clients were connected to women he dated. They included quotes from the poker night recording and testimony from all the victims. The report ended with recommendations for policy changes to prevent similar situations. Law firms should have better oversight of cases involving attorneys' family connections. The Bar Association should require attorneys to disclose potential conflicts more thoroughly. Clients should receive clearer information about their right to second opinions. A handwritten note from Gavin was clipped to the front page thanking me for coming forward and saying my courage had led to meaningful reforms. Reading through the report felt surreal. Seeing everything documented in official language made it feel more real somehow. Colin's actions were now part of the permanent record. Future lawyers would study this case in ethics classes. I kept the report in my desk drawer and looked at it sometimes when I needed to remember that speaking up had mattered. In November, Gavin invited me to attend a legal ethics conference where they'd be discussing my dad's case as an example of attorney misconduct. I almost didn't go because the idea of hearing strangers analyze what happened felt uncomfortable. But Macy encouraged me during our session that week. She said hearing legal professionals discuss the case might help me see the bigger impact of what I'd done. The conference was at a hotel downtown with about 200 lawyers and law students attending. I sat in the back during the ethics panel where a law professor presented Colin's case. She walked through the timeline and explained how Colin's pattern of sabotage had gone undetected for years. She discussed the warning signs that clients and colleagues should watch for. Several lawyers in the audience asked questions about how to prevent similar situations in their own firms. One young lawyer talked about implementing new case review procedures. Another discussed creating better channels for clients to report concerns. Listening to them treat my dad's suffering as a learning opportunity felt strange at first. But then I realized that's exactly what it should be. Colin had hurt people, and now his actions were being used to protect future clients. That felt like justice in a different way than his disbarment. Walking out of that conference, I felt like I'd contributed something meaningful to the legal profession, even though I wasn't a lawyer myself. A year after that poker night when Miles called me with the recording, my life looked completely different. I'd gotten another promotion at work and was managing a small team. Dad was fully retired and spent his time working on the fund and playing golf 3 times a week. Mom had started taking art classes and seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in decades. Our family dinners happened every couple weeks and felt easy and comfortable. We didn't talk about Colin anymore unless someone brought up the fund or a case it had helped with. The anger I'd felt that night in Colin's apartment had transformed into something calmer. I wasn't consumed by rage or bitterness. Instead, I felt satisfied knowing Colin would never practice law again and couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt Dad. Justice wasn't always fast or perfect, but sometimes when you gathered evidence and refused to back down, the system actually worked. I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I'd learned that standing up for what's right was worth the discomfort and stress. Most importantly, I'd learned that betrayal doesn't have to break you if you channel your pain into action, instead of letting it consume you. Life was genuinely good now. I was dating someone new who treated my family with actual respect. Dad was happy and financially secure. Our family had survived something terrible and come out stronger on the other side. Every time I saw Dad's name on a settlement check for someone the fund had helped, I felt grateful that I'd trusted myself enough to expose Colin's lies. Some people get away with hurting others, but Colin wasn't one of them, and that knowledge brought me more peace than any apology from him ever could have.